Okay. All right, we're going to start by talking about the history of the Latin alphabet. And this is from Letter Fountain, History of the Latin Alphabet. So there are lots of other alphabets, Cyrillic, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, Braille. But we're going to focus on the 26 letters, 10 numbers, punctuation marks that evolved over 50,000 years. And it all started with the sign. The first forms of written communication were cave paintings. And these were found in Lascaux, France, 50,000 years ago. They were drawings on substrate, stones, clay tablets, animal skins, leathers, leaves, and papyrus, wood and bamboo, ivory, and wax. What did they draw? Well, they were drawing complex scenes and figures to record hunting territories. Sometimes they included simple lines to indicate quantities or directions. I had the opportunity to go to Cork, Ireland, and visit Cork University. They have an exhibition of ogams and carved stones. They call them stories in stones. And what these were is these giant stones that they lined the hallways of the university in. That's actually my son when he was in middle school. And he's now 6'3", so he would have been as tall as these now, but he was, they were big. I mean, they were huge. They were the size of people. And the interesting thing about them is these little nicks and carved like slashes into the stones were becoming an alphabet. They were becoming a way to communicate and distinguish people's names. And so what they've done is they've decoded them, and they've discovered that the oldest Ogham alphabet uses a series of 20 characters arranged in 4 groups of 5, with characters made up between 1 of 5 scored lines and notches. And so you can see here in this example, they have deciphered the code. And what they've discovered is that each of these, whether the straight line is indicating the kind of stem or the seam in the stone, the kind of line with that kind of naturally forms in the stone, and then they made the lines on one side of the line or the other side of the line, or go straight through the line, the stem of the stone. And you can kind of see how they kind of looked for the stem of the stone. But it was really fascinating. And basically these were giving history of the names of people that were high up in their tribes. And most of these were men, of course. There were a couple women, but mostly of them, they were all referencing men. And it was just another way to look at the way people were communicating and how we've been able to translate them. Ireland has the good fortune of never being invaded as severely as many other places. So they have a lot more history in old texts and ways to decipher these things. That's why Cork has such a collection of them. But we go on to primal pictograph writing systems. So those were just lines. Now we're moving more into pictures. And this was not necessarily connected to the spoken language. The primitive typesetter did not have a word, only concepts. The depiction of objects expanded into form legible connections. And what does this remind us of today? When we look at all of these little pictures, what do you guys think of? What are we using today? Who can tell me?
Emojis.
Emojis, exactly. So here we have something, this primal pictograph writing system that was used, and we're back to it. We've moved back to it. There's our emojis. So then we have the transition, the ideal, the clay tablet from Mesopotamia, some 5,000 years later, more systematic. What do you see here in this clay tablet? Are we seeing something that kind of speaks to something we're also familiar with today? It's the first signs of a grid, right? We're seeing a grid being used. So here we have a grid being used, and we're doing a couple different things. We're seeing these pictographs found in the clay tablet in Mesopotamia, but then we're also seeing these little indents that were created by little notches. You see, they're kind of like shadowed. What that is that someone took their fingers and pressed into the soft clay, kind of in a way to count. And so you think about this idea of pushing their fingers into the clay to indent it as a way to count. Plus you have the grid system, plus you have the pictograph system, lots of different ways that they're indicating this form of communication. And originally these were upper left, right-hand corner vertical columns. Eventually the scribes turned the tablets sideways to avoid smearing. It's primarily record keeping. This was the way they were keeping records. The cuneiform happening in 3000 BC is referred to wedge shape. So they're kind of referring to the tool that was used to draw these characters. And each of these systems are driven by changes in tools. So they're no longer using clay. This is still 560 characters. It was in fact very limited because it was just too many. No one could keep track of it all. The cuneiform development was through the hieroglyphics in Egypt, 1450 BC, combining objects and pictograms, about 700. So we're not going down, we're kind of going higher. And then we get to the point of the famous Rosetta Stone. This is the most contemporary forms of writing descended from Egyptian hieroglyphs. It took roughly 7,000 languages are spoken in the world today, and communicating in multiple languages is becoming more and more common. In typography, still using multiple languages requires handling different scripts from time to time. Learning how different scripts work can give us some insight into how writing has developed. In 1779, the French officer Pierre-Francois Bouchard found the slab of granite that changed the study of ancient languages. Now known as the Rosetta Stone, it featured the same text in 3 languages: Demonic, Egyptian, hieroglyphs, and Greek. The discovery led to the deciphering of hieroglyphs 20 years later. The Rosetta Stone shows societies were always multilingual. So here we have the cradle of the alphabet map. And it starts in the Middle Eastern region 3,000 years ago, the Sumerian cuneiform script and the early Semitic alphabet. The first written appeared around 3200 BC in Egypt, Iraq, and India. In Africa, the Giaz script, the basis of Ethiopian script, was developed around 2000 BC. The Chinese system dates back to at least 1200 BC. In Mexico, the first Mesoamerican scripts date back from 600 BC. Many older signs and symbols have not been deciphered yet, and the invention of writing is probably much older. The history of writing. The letters from the Latin alphabet can be traced back to the 5,000-year-old Egyptian hieroglyphs. but they do not share its pictographic meanings. The letter A resembles an ox to help readers memorize the alphabet, as an A is for elf, ox in Hebrew. Materials and efficiency mattered, and the first written languages did not use alphabets but pure graphic symbols that each represented a picture or an idea. Several forms of picture writing systems developed. People by river used clay and reed. Wedge shapes, round forms were too hard. Papyrus was easy to draw on and could create picture scripts. The Phoenicians, who are credited with inventing the first alphabet in 1250 BC, they developed 22 consonants written from right to left. They were traders and spread the alphabet. So they were trading with Greek. And so the Greeks adopted it and made the word alphabet from alpha and beta, meaning ox and house. They added the vowels A, E, O, Y, and invented the letter I. They settled on writing from left to right, and they spread this to the rest of the Mediterranean world into the Roman Empire. The Greek papyrus manuscript, 350 BC, eventually the Greeks settled on writing from left to right. And they helped us kind of military conquest and commercial expansion demanded keeping track of that information. And so that was important to keeping straight. Once we get over to Roman and the Holy Roman Empires, the alphabet matured into an extremely harmonious form. The peak of the designed letter form known as the Roman capital. The capitals monumentals, the Trajan column, eternal monumental, formal, first drawn in ink with a flat brush on stone. Then they chiseled it into straight forms. And then in 1989, Carol Twombly redrew and created a digital version. There it is on the Trajan column. Hold on.
I took two things that I love, dancing and dogs, and I made them into a successful business. Hi, I'm Ronnie. I'm the owner of Ketatov, and I teach people all over the world.
Can you see the YouTube, or not, with this? Are you guys seeing? Okay, good. I wasn't sure if you could see it.
If you're sitting in a movie theater during previews and you see this, you know to expect a comedy movie. If you see this, you know it's going to be action. Make the letters a little skinny, and boom. It's sci-fi. You know this one's going to have fast cars, this one's going to have Michael Cera, and this one is going to be a rom-com. You don't even need the music to know it. But what about this? This typeface, Trajan, is probably one of the most popular movie poster fonts ever. You can see it in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Double Jeopardy, Letters from Iwo Jima, Titanic, Joe Black, Ash in the Bottle. It's everywhere. So how did it get there?
I'm Yves Peters. I'm a graphic designer who has been writing professionally about type and typography since about 10 years.
Yves has looked at a lot of posters, and a few years ago, he started to notice a trend.
So I started clicking. I didn't know where I started because I ended up looking at about 16,000 posters.
How many posters did you look at?
Yeah, well, I look at about 100 posters per month, and I've been doing this series since 2006. It's a lot of posters every year. Yeah.
He noticed that the use of Trajan rose significantly in the last couple of decades. But why? In 1989, designer Carol Twombly adapted inscriptions from Roman Emperor Trajan's column into a digital typeface. It was made for Adobe, so it was a part of the software that a lot of people were starting to use to make posters. A couple years later, it made its movie poster debut here for Hector Babenco's At Play in the Fields of the Lord. After that, it was on The Bodyguard and Scent of a Woman. Then it was on 3 1993 box office hits. By 1994, it was everywhere.
It's originally used for epic movies, movies about people that overcome difficulties, like the big war epics and so on. But then you see gradually that it becomes the standard movie font. It's like the Arial of movie posters. So people need to turn out a poster really quickly and they just pick Trajan.
Eventually, that overuse started to change the kinds of movies that would use the typeface.
You don't see it as much on the big productions anymore. It's become the typeface of the horror movies, the B movies, and also the straight-to-video ones. So you see that a lot of posters are for the lesser movies that want to pretend they are better than they actually are.
The rise and fall of Trajan illustrates the downside of digital typeface. The convenience of swapping fonts is a huge shift from the old movie poster days when hand-painted typefaces, or lettering, was an art that was specific to each movie.
So what you see behind me, this is more like the pre-blockbuster thing. Pre-genres, pre-standard styles, and that's why you will be hard-pressed to find two that are similar.
That doesn't make today's genre-specific typography bad design. These visual cliches make it possible to communicate tone and plot details to an audience incredibly efficiently, and there's a certain art to that.
People get nostalgic about the old era of movie posters when everything was still done by hand and still very unique, but you could compare it to music, where some people say, oh, nothing good was produced since the Beatles. But then there's other people say that nothing good was produced since Mozart. Fair enough, but there's many other interesting things that are being produced now. There's just much more, but there's still a lot of very good poster design happening. It's just you need to know where to look.
All right. Wait, let's get that up. There we go. Okay. All right. So how many of you are familiar with Trajan, had seen any of those? I mean, are you familiar with the name Trajan when you think of typefaces? Heard of it? Okay. I got one. All right, well, let's keep going. And now hopefully you'll remember Trajan because it's something that we've seen everywhere over many years now. And it's still being used a lot. So Carol Twombly brought that out of the Holy Roman Empire. And now we're going into majuscules are basically capital letter forms. They're what we now think of capital letter forms. So here's an example. Oops, I went too far. Here's an example of capitals quattro, a Roman square capital, another form of a majuscule script, upright script on papyrus using broad-nibbed quill or a goose quill. It's slightly less formal than the Trajan, right? Less formal than Trajan. You can see that. It looks a little more script-like. Here we have more examples of it, the square capital. Here we have the rustic capital, used a long time. The quill was held at an angle, increasing the writing spell. So it's kind of like the italic version, right, of a capital. It's the italic, if you will, kind of the early days before we actually officially had that. Then we move into this craziness. This is called Roman cursive. It's for fast, used for notes in a book margin. It's the idea is for legibility to let some letters extend below or above the baseline. So this is basically the first time we're starting to see the invention, if you will, of a ascender and a descender on a letter form. Then we move into this Roman unicals. This is the proliferation of manuscript writing. Now, we're still writing everything by hand. There are no machines printing anything. Everything's being written by hand. And this cursive, this half unical is used in the Book of Kells back to Ireland. So the Book of Kells was oh, it is at 9:30 already. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Rain. I appreciate it. I didn't see the time. So we're basically at the end here. So we have the Book of Kells, and I'll pick up this ending of it on Tuesday when I see you. Thank you. I didn't realize how late we had gotten. Let me stop the share. Let me